Well, today we're going to talk about one of the largest industries in America, which is agriculture, Randy. And I actually come from an agriculture background. My family has always been in row crop farming. We're fifth generation now. We know nothing about cattle. The only thing I know about cattle is that I like to eat what they produce, and I know you do too.
What, you like manure?
Not quite that, but it seems like that all the industries now in America, no matter what industry we're talking about, they are just overruled or overregulated. It seems like it's just lobbyists get involved, lawmakers, and if they would just leave business owners, entrepreneurs, and in this case, people in agriculture, leave them the heck alone and let them do their job, we'd have a lot better America.
So the issue now is the electronic ID tags on cattle and bison. All I can see is a non-farmer that this can increase cattle or beef cost. It is going to benefit some of the larger packing facilities, feedlots, and it opens the whole door for different narratives like ESG and climate change and all that nonsense. So that's kind of where we stand on that.
So we have a great guest today on our show. Harriet Hageman is a Republican congresswoman from the great state of Wyoming. Harriet, Hank, thank you so much for joining us today on this show. I want you to educate Randy and me, and as well as our guests and our viewers and our audience, because this is something we really know nothing about. Randy approached me and said, hey, we want to have a gal on from Wyoming.
You keep saying Wisconsin.
Talking about, they do cheese, but talking about ID ear tags for cattle. I'm like, Randy, that's so far off topic for what we normally do at Patriots with Grit. You got to educate me, Randy. And so he starts talking to me about he's done a lot of research on what you and your team have been doing in Wyoming. So talk to us a little bit about why we need to be paying attention to electronic ID tags for cattle and bison, because to me, as a non-cattle farmer, I have really no idea what we're talking about here. So, and I think that's probably the majority of our viewers, Randy, wouldn't you?
Yep.
So I want to thank you both for having me on this podcast. And it is a very important issue, even if it's something that some people might say, why would that affect me? Why do I care? I'm going to give you a bit of history about how we got to this point and why this is so critically important for our food supply. So actually, starting back in 2011, the USDA started trying to push forward with they referred to it as RFID back then, radio frequency identification ear tag mandate. And the cattle industry and bison industry pushed back very, very, very hard for a lot of reasons. One is feasibility, one is cost. There are all kinds of reasons as to why RFID was a bad idea. And so ultimately what they did, and what the USDA and a sub-agency called APHIS were saying that they needed to do this, was it related to disease traceability. They wanted to make sure that if there was a situation with hoof and mouth disease or brucellosis, they would be able to very quickly trace that livestock. We have the most robust traceability system in the entire world already in place in the United States, and it's why we have the safest meat of anywhere in the world. And so what ended up happening is in 2013, after all the pushback from a variety of industries, the USDA came out with a rule that said, okay, well, we're going to use our traditional, typical, long-standing traceability type techniques, which are brands and ear tags and back tags and tattoos. And our livestock producers are allowed to use any one of those that best fit in with their type of operation. So in 2019, out of the blue, the APHIS, again, USDA, issued a 2-page document on their website and said by January 1, 2023, all livestock and bison producers were going to have to start using RFID ear tags. No rulemaking, no notice, nothing. And at the time that they were doing this proposed rulemaking way back in 2013, USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, estimated that it would cost the industry between $1.2 and $1.9 billion. If they were going to do a full disease traceability program with RFID ear tags, it would cost between $1.2 and $1.9 billion for the livestock industry. So then they come out with this rule, and it was actually a guidance document. It wasn't even a rule in 2019, and said, well, by January 1, 2023, everybody has to do this. Well, I was hired by some livestock producers and a livestock organization. They hired me. I filed a lawsuit against this particular guidance document, and we won. And USDA recognized they did not have the legal authority to do this, so they withdrew it. But this is really big business, and this is kind of your effort by the four big packers and your ear tag manufacturing companies, they're not going to give up on this. And so in the ensuing 5 years, we have battled and pushed back and battled and pushed back. And now in January of this year, they actually adopted a rule or a regulation that will require roughly 10% of our cattle and bison producers to start using what they now refer to as electronic identification ear tags. They estimate that cost is going to be about $26.1 million, but keep in mind, it only applies to 10% of the industry right now. And so just doing the math, and they're totally underestimating the cost anyway, but just doing the math, if they were to actually adopt a full-blown EID mandate, it's going to be over $250 million for the livestock and bison industry. And there's a lot of reasons as to why this is a bad idea, but I think we can get into that as we have our dialogue. But I wanted to give people that history and that background because the advocates for this have been trying for almost 2 decades now, in addition to which the USDA has been trying to force this down the throats of our livestock and bison producers. And it's just a really bad idea.
Well, there's so many thoughts going through my head with this. I just asked him before the show, we grew up in a small town, and I said, how many people back when we were kids raised hogs? Everybody did.
We did. We had a few head of hogs just to eat during the slaughter during the winter for
there
food.
was some big hog farmers, but now everything's corporate.
Everything.
So the way
the point of this. That's the point of this. This is about vertical integration. So our poultry industry and our pork industry have all been vertically integrated. So what you have is we have 4 big packers in the United States in terms of our beef industry. 2 of them are owned by folks out of Brazil. 1 is China owned and 1 is American owned. They want this because this is about vertical integration. So when I say that this is cost prohibitive, the $26.1 million that the USDA claims this will cost actually only pays for the RFID ear tag itself. It only pays for the button. It doesn't pay for the wands. It doesn't pay for retrofitting your corrals and your facilities to be able to do this. It doesn't pay for your livestock handling. It doesn't pay the cost associated with the software and hardware that you have to buy. And it doesn't pay for what we have to do with our sale barns. So what they've done, and again, it only applies to 10% of the 11%. They estimate it would apply to about 11% of the industry right now. And they've done this intentionally because this is what you see agencies do. It's incrementalism. And what they do is they start small so that people don't realize what's going on. And then they ratchet it up and ratchet it up and ratchet it up. So yes, this is going to be absolutely cost prohibitive to the industry and to those folks who have to comply.
Well, I have to jump in here. I was talking to our farm manager today, and we were just discussing, how, and we've had several good years. Don't get me wrong. We raise corn and soybeans here in Missouri, but the cost. We had a conversation today of what the cost of propane was because we dry our corn after we pick it out of the field in August and September. What the cost of propane was, say, 25, 30 years ago, and the cost of diesel versus what it is now. We did the math. It's about a 6 times increase. We looked at the cost of a bushel of corn or a bushel of beans today versus 20, 25 years ago. They're not anywhere near 6 times. Everything's gone. Our insurance with our insurance company has gone up 37%. We just learned today, Randy, starting January 1st, 2025, Evergy, which is the energy company here in this part of Missouri, it looks like they're going to be doing a 13.42% increase for Northwest Missouri. So that's just on the energy level. That doesn't take into consideration the cost of trading equipment. We used to trade our John Deere equipment. We have a lot of combines and tractors, and we used to trade them about every 2 to 3 years. Now the cost, we went out the other day to look at a brand new John Deere combine with a bean head and or a corn head for picking corn. You're over $1 million. It's like $1,028,000 for one piece of equipment. And we used to trade for a 2 to 3 year difference in years for just 30 or 40 grand. And the cost, the farmers are just getting, it is. And parts, we have more parts and repairs bills this year than we've ever had probably in history. And just the cost of everything, whether it's a motor for an irrigator or whether it's a motor. We just put up a brand new grain bin, a 60,000 bushel bin. And just the cost to put that thing up was over $200,000. And it just seems like the people, I said COVID was nothing but a green light for massive inflation and supply shortages. And like you said, they ratchet everything up incrementally. Let me give you an example. I'll get off my bandwagon here. The new grain bin we just built, we have to put in all this infrastructure for electronic components, new breaker boxes, new electrical boxes. So we called the electrical supply company the other day, said, hey, we need to price this, I think like a 400 amp box. They're like, well, we can get you the 400 amp box. It's going to be about 12 weeks. Here's the cost. We're like, okay. But the guy's like, this was all started with all the COVID craziness, the supply chain shortage, and the cost of all these parts. He said, I have all the components here to make you the box for a lot less money, and you can have it just within a few days. So it's all getting people acclimated to supply chain shortages, cost increases. My mom was complaining earlier today. She's like, you know how much a pound of all beef bologna was at Walmart? I said, I have no idea. I don't really eat bologna. $7.82 for a package of bologna in Missouri.
That's a bunch of bologna.
That's a bunch of bologna right there, Randy. So Harriet, I don't think people really understand. I mean, the farmers they're up against they're up against the pen right now on all this stuff, costs and everything. So what are they going to do?
So the price of the input has skyrocketed, but the commodity prices themselves have not increased at the same level, and that's what you're saying. The other thing is who is going to be making these electronic ear tags? Do you think we will manufacture them here in the United States, or do you think they're coming from China? Of course not. But here's one other thing that people really need to understand. There's two things that I think are incredibly important about this. This is about control, because as I stated at the beginning of this, and why the history is so important, is we already have the very best disease traceability program of anywhere in the world. That's why our meat is considered the highest quality of anywhere in the world. And so what you have is it's a solution in search of a problem. Okay, so that's one of the issues that I think people need to understand. We're not fixing a problem here. We're already very capable of very quickly tracing a diseased animal back to the source. So people need to understand that. This isn't like we've got diseased cattle and bison running all over the place. That's not the circumstance. We have very healthy herds. We have very healthy livestock. We have really good and competent livestock producers in the United States. But what happened is in early 2022, Ireland adopted an EID mandate. And by August of 2023, they issued a slaughter order that their cattle producers needed to slaughter 41,000 head of cattle, not because of a disease outbreak, but because of global warming.
No, come on now.
Okay, because of global warming, because of climate change. This is how they know where the animals are. This is how the government can actually then tell us how many you have to cull your herd by, how much what you have to pay in terms of a carbon tax. Denmark, 2 months ago, they were one of the very first countries in the United States to adopt a mandatory EID rule. They have now imposed a $100 per head cattle carbon tax on every cattle producer in the country of Denmark. This is about global warming. This is about climate change, because one of the other things you have to do, if you're going to have a traceability program, you have to be able to tie that animal to a particular location, right? So the other thing that they're going to try to force us to do is we have to adopt what is called a premises identification number. So every rancher is going to have to register their ranch with the federal government so that they can then tie that to that particular cattle, whether it is a spayed heifer or it is a 1,500-pound steer, so that they can tie that radio identification ear tag steer back to a particular parcel of property. Now, in some places that might be okay, but in Wyoming, we have what are called common allotments. 48% of our surface estate is owned by the federal government. We have a BLM common allotment in the central part of the state that is 200,000 acres, and all of the ranchers in that area use it. So their cattle are actually interspersed. We have cattle on the east side of the state where they run in Wyoming and South Dakota at the same time. There isn't a fence that differentiates Wyoming and South Dakota. So here we have this situation where we're going to have to figure out how to even make this feasible, because right now it's not feasible what they're trying to do. In addition to which, I can tell you, having been a ranch girl myself, being out on the back of a horse 40 miles from anywhere, we don't have the internet. And so they're imposing these mandates against us that are not feasible. Yet here's what they're doing. They're saying, if you don't do it, you cannot sell your cattle across state lines. So in Wyoming, we don't have big packers. We don't have big packing plants. In Colorado and Montana and Idaho, we don't have big packing plants. Our livestock, during their life cycle, almost all of our feeder cattle have to go to another state, whether it's Nebraska or Kansas or Oklahoma. They have to go to another state. So it's going to apply against us, but it won't apply against ranchers in Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, because they have all the packing plants. So that is what's so bizarre about this, and that's why I say it's incrementalism. They're enforcing this against folks in Wyoming now and states that don't have packers, but they're going to have to ratchet it up, because unless it covers the entire industry, it's not a traceability rule. Because what happens with the cow in Kansas that they didn't have to put an RFID ear tag in it, and that's the one with the disease, but they can't trace it the way that they say that we have to. So
well, it's when they cross the state line is when they get sick, apparently. Because the physical line, because that's the question I had with all the feedlots in Kansas. If they never leave the state, they don't have to be checked with a electronic tag.
No, and here's the irony. In Wyoming, on my family's ranch, you don't get disease outbreaks because they're out in, 10, 50, they're out in huge pastures. It's when they're in confined animal feeding operations that you potentially have a disease outbreak. And according to the USDA, they don't have to have the RFID ear tag. So that's why I keep saying this is a problem. This is a solution in search. This is a problem in search. However I said that. This is a solution in search of a problem. But what it's about is control, because what the USDA is also trying to do, and they're starting with our schools right now, they have what's called BQA, Beef Quality Assurance Standards. And this is like a 56 point checklist that they're going to try to force all of our livestock producers to comply with. The problem is it's absolutely cost prohibitive. And again, they aren't solving problems. If there was some issue out there that we needed to address, your livestock producers are willing to address them. But what it comes back to, and you said it earlier, is this comes back to ESG, it comes back to global warming, it comes back to climate change, it comes back to controlling our livestock industry. One other thing people need to know, a lot of our bison are raised and produced and managed by our Indian tribes. Indian tribes do not see bison as livestock. They see them as wildlife. Mm-hmm. They don't handle them. They don't put them through chutes. They don't ear tag them. Do you want to be the guy out there who's trying to put 100 head of buffalo through a chute in a day? I'm not going to do it. They don't even have the infrastructure to be putting all of their bison through chutes to be able to ear tag them. And they don't look at them that way. They're managed as wildlife.
Well, I got to jump in here. When I was a little kid, we would raise soybeans, and we would raise certified seed. So in the late fall, early winter, after we harvested, my family, my uncle primarily, who was basically the patriarch of the farm, we had a seed cleaning operation on our farm where we would actually run them through this seed cleaner and bag them up and sew the bags and put them on pallets of 50 per pallet. And then in the spring, we would sell the certified seed to farmers to plant, and that's how they kept. And then I didn't know anything about this because I was away from the farm for several years when I was running our company. I didn't know anything about all this until I watched a documentary, I think it was on Netflix, and I don't know if it was Food Inc. or it was one of those documentaries, and it started talking about the evils of like the big three or the big four, one of which is Monsanto. And they start talking about how now Monsanto have all these patents on seed, and if you're a Amish farmer and you clean your own seed and plant it, and it cross pollinates with the guy next door, then they get their tails in a whiz, and so I'm like, wait a second, you got companies like Monsanto, and then they talk about how these company CEOs go on to be people in the government working at the USDA or people from the USDA go to work in Monsanto as corporate members of the board. And I'm like, this is kind of...
Haven't we seen that with the CDC?
This is kind of nefarious.
Pharma?
And that was like 8 years ago. That was way before COVID. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, something's not right here with all these overrulings and over-regulations. And I don't think people really know the impact that this is going to have on farmers. But I want to ask you before we get into the next thing, who are the four big packers that you keep referring to?
Well, like JBS, okay. And the JBS out of Brazil. But these are the companies that they like vertical integration. They want to be able to control our food supply chain, our meat supply chain, and Walmart's already doing it. Walmart has gone and they have bought a lot of ranches, and so they purchase. They don't purchase. They raise their own livestock all the way up through slaughter, and that's what the others want to do. They don't want to have to deal with ranchers.
Wait! So you're telling me Walmart has their own slaughterhouses?
Walmart is almost vertically integrated. Yes,
no kidding.
And that's what these other companies want to do. And also keep in mind, one of the biggest advocates for the RFID mandate starting in the 2011 period of time, and since then the ensuing 15 years, is ear tag manufacturing companies. Now, go figure, right? Yeah. They're the ones working with USDA and APHIS to make sure that this is mandatory, because it's their product that is going to be mandated to be put in the ear of every head of livestock in the country. So I cannot emphasize enough that this is about controlling our food chain. And there's a couple other points that I want to make in that regard. We recently had a hearing with the Judiciary Committee, and we brought in folks who are very active in the ESG movement, and the people who are trying to dictate what these companies can invest in and what kind of activities they can engage in. There are three sectors of our economy that they are targeting. They're targeting our energy industry. Obviously, that's been going on for quite some time. Oil and gas and coal and uranium. And so they're targeting, and very heavily have been targeting our fossil fuel industry, our reliable and affordable energy for quite some time. That's why your propane has skyrocketed. They're also targeting the airline industry. They want to stop us from traveling. They have made it very clear that they think that we travel too much, we are too free, and they are trying to force the airline industry to make it so that literally they take away our ability to travel, that there will only be a small segment of our society that will be wealthy enough to actually travel by airplane. And they make no bones about it. That's the intent. And the third industry that they are targeting is the meat industry. They think we eat too much meat. They don't want us eating meat. They don't want us to access to that protein. And so the third industry, so they're targeting our ability to heat our homes, and they're targeting our ability to put food on the table, and they're targeting our ability to go see our grandchildren in the wintertime. That is who ESG is. That's who this current administration is aligned with. And this is just one more notch in that belt, if you will. This is one more effort to be able to control the food supply. As I said, they already control poultry and pork. Now they want to control beef, because what is the other thing that ranchers control and manage? Fairly large swaths of land throughout the entire interior West. And you put them out of business, then you're right there with the environmental groups being able to take land out of production and stop us from raising cattle on federal lands and private lands. And, sometimes I study and I look at this and I think, this is crazy. Why are we even in this position? But we are. And the folks that we had in front of us, it was the head of CalPERS, the guy that runs the entire pension system for the state of California. This is what they're doing. It's the public employees pension system in California, but it's the largest pension system in the United States, if not the world. And this is their push on ESG, and those are the three industries that they're targeting.
I'm surprised the people that I talk to primarily, and I'm going to reference the agricultural community again, when I say ESG, they're like, well, what does that mean? What are you talking about? I'm like, environmental social governance. They're like, well, what is that? I'm like, it's just easier for you to research it than for me to explain it to you, because if you don't know what it is, it's time you get educated on it, and get educated on it now. But again, going back, just a few weeks ago, we had about was it the DEA or the FDA? Who was it that raided the Amish farmers in Pennsylvania for the raw milk? I'm
USDA.
like, who are these
I don't know if
people?
it was CDC or USDA. I don't know who it was, but yes, they are raiding Amish farmers, and there's never been any problem with his milk. But again, they are attempting to control the independence. They're attempting to limit our access to the kind of food that we want. So this really does go back to, I'll say it this way, as they say, if you control energy, if you control the energy supply, you control countries. If you control the food supply, you control the masses, you control the people. And I'll give you an example of where this has played out over the last 30 or 35 years. Sudan has been in the middle of a civil war for years, but starting in the 80s and 90s, they started putting all their people in refugee camps. They took them off the farms. They took them off the places where they were growing and raising food. And most of their people live in refugee camps. What do they do to control the masses every time? And they've been controlled and overseen by a dictator and a despot and tyrants for the last several decades. And what do they do if they ever try to fight back? They cut off the food supply. Over 90% of the food that is consumed in Sudan is imported. So if they ever have to control the masses, they just cut off the food supply. That's an extreme circumstance, and I'll give you that. That's an extreme circumstance, but it gives you an idea of what happens when you allow a very few people to control the entire supply chain that we have for providing food to 330 million people, which is what we're talking about with these issues.
Well, I know the guy on the TV always says we're at a 3 to 7% slight uptick with inflation, which I think his numbers are off. I don't know which college he went to for math, but like I gave the Evergy example earlier in the show, 13.42% increase in utility bills, electric bills, starting in January of 2025. Think what that's going to do to middle America, the factory worker, the teacher, the nurse. They're like, oh, it's just 13.4%, whatever, Well, groceries are up like, what, 20, 25, 30%, and they keep hearing in their minds 4 to 7, 4 to 7, 4 to 7. So they think this current and the new administration is going to be fantastic, and they're willing to take a 13% increase, but really it's more like 30. So I don't know what the American people are going to do if all this craziness and nonsense continues, because we're going to be overregulated and overinflated to where people can't continue to raise their kids and pay their utility bills and buy gas.
And they'll stop eating meat, won't they? Isn't that part of as I said, they've targeted 3 industries. They've targeted energy, travel, and food. So here's the thing is that you say 13.4%, but that's going to be a year-over-year increase because we're seeing it in Wyoming as well.
No way.
You most likely don't irrigate the way that we do in Wyoming because we're part of the arid West, but we have what are called center pivots.
That's what we have.
And so when it's a 13% increase for your household, maybe that's $50, maybe it's more than that, maybe it's 75, maybe it's even more than that. But for someone who has to operate a center pivot to grow their corn, their alfalfa, their beans, their sugar beets, whatever it may be, it is thousands of dollars a month in increase in fees. So again, it's targeting our food supply directly. And I'm going to tell you why else this is happening. Because we have, with the EPA and these various policies coming out of the Biden administration, we have been focusing on wind and solar, both of which are unreliable and unaffordable, and they are not feasible to provide reliable energy the way that they need it. And so I've been fighting with the utilities in the state of Wyoming on this very issue because I've said, you've got to start taking our side. You have to start defending us. You get a monopoly because you are required to provide affordable, reliable energy. And you have allowed this administration to pay you off to do wind and solar that you then have to have a redundancy with something that is reliable, whether it is hydropower or it is a coal-fired power plant or it's gas or it's nuclear. So we have a situation where these electric utilities have been bought off by this administration. And an example is Rocky Mountain Power in Wyoming. They keep saying, well, we received an $85 million tax credit from the United States for doing wind and solar. And my response was, no, you were paid $85 million not to produce electricity. That doesn't do anything for me. And it doesn't do anything for our farmers. And it doesn't do anything for our households and our schools and our industries. You're being paid by the federal government that is $35 trillion in debt not to produce energy. That's wrong. That's bad policy.
I'm gonna dive deep into this too, because I'm sitting here angry. This is the same template that we saw with the CDC and, wanting vaccines and all that stuff. We know that whole story. But as you being on the inside, there's people that you work with or exposed to that are for this stuff, not because they have common sense, but because there's something in it for them, or they have a relationship. They're going to be the next CEO of a company once they get out of politics.
Walk us through the chain of that, Harriet. I want to know how the politicians come in making 70 or 80 grand when they leave, they're worth millions.
Well, I don't know the answer to that because that sure hasn't happened with me. I've only been there a year and a half, but what I'm limited to is I have my salary and my husband is retired, and so that it is what it is. I do think that there is some of that goes on in Congress, but I think that it's even in many ways for me more insidious than that, because I think that Congress over the last 30 years especially, and I'm not picking on any one person, I think that this has been a collective outcome by allowing these unelected bureaucrats and administrative agencies to adopt regulations that have, if not tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and potentially billions of dollars of impact on our economy, and Congress never pushing back and saying, wait, the EPA doesn't have the authority to do that. So I think that there are a lot of people who are complicit in it. And yes, I understand the revolving door type concept, and that annoys people. But the bigger issue is the fact that, just as an example, administrative agencies will typically pass as many as 3,500 regulations a year, and Congress is lucky if it passes 200 bills a year. And what that tells you is that the unelected bureaucrats and the executive agencies are the ones that are making these decisions. So why in the world would we ever allow the USDA to adopt a regulation that could have a $1.2 to $1.9 billion economic impact on our livestock industry? If Congress had any integrity whatsoever, if our elected representatives had any integrity, they'd say, no. If that is something that should be imposed, it must be imposed by us. And then you have accountability, because these people have to go back to Wyoming and Idaho and Montana and Utah and Kansas and Missouri and Texas and say, hey, I just passed a bill that's going to cost your industry $1.9 billion. That isn't what happens. And it happens in every sector of our economy, whether it's the transportation sector, it's the food sector, it's USDA, it's EPA. The EPA claiming that mud puddles are navigable waters of the United States, it destroys our ability to irrigate. Why in the world? At no time did Congress ever give the EPA authority to do that, but we just rely on the courts to try to fix those problems. And fortunately, over the last couple of years, the United States Supreme Court has been much more aligned with my idea of separation of powers. But that's the real travesty. That's the real scandal, is that we send people to Congress who do not fully understand that we have to totally take this power away from the executive branch and start doing our jobs.
Well, you mentioned a while ago center pivots. I know that's what we use here on our farms, and a family member just bought a new one the other day for their side of the family. And I think previously when we bought one, it was around $113,000. This year, their new one was $180,000. And just in the last week, Randy, he calls me. He's like, "Hey, got a flat tire on one, got a bad motor on one of the wheels. And now the GPS is not tracking, so we can either get new GPS system or go back to the old system or try to update the software. It might not work." And I'm like, just the cost for those, for a motor, for GPS, and for the tire, you're talking thousands of dollars for one unit. And it's just literally, it's no stopping it. I don't know what people are going to do. Yeah.
Well, and that's the inflationary pressures. And, I've always said that our prosperity is dependent upon three things, and that's affordable energy, affordable food, and affordable housing. And those are the three things that have really set us apart from most countries in the world, not only third world countries, but even the communist countries clearly, but even other Western countries. Attempting to buy a home in England or Ireland or Scotland, Sweden, astronomical. Our prosperity has been based on those three things, but really the foundation of it is when we started producing, it was the commercial production of affordable energy. is really what changed the trajectory of this country and our lives. My mother is 100 years old. She's going to be 101 years old this year. She grew up on a dairy farm in Minnesota, and they would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they would milk the cows, and they would tend the garden, and they would tend to their fields, and they would can their food, and they would chop their wood. That was 100 years ago. That was their existence. And maybe they would go into a dance once a month in town, in the nearest town. And if they ever went on a trip, it was like unheard of. Well, you now look at our prosperity. You look at our cars that we drive. You look at the homes that we live in. You look at the jewelry that we wear, the clothing that we wear. You look at our prosperity. You look at the increase in life expectancy and the decrease in infant mortality rate. You look at what we're able to do in terms of curing cancer and other types of what used to be terminal illnesses at 40 years old. You look at what we've done, and every single bit of it comes back to the commercial production of affordable energy. And we are at war right now with this administration and the globalists, the UN, the WHO, all these, Carl Schwab, these people who want to destroy that. And we have got to do everything in our power to make sure that we are able to continue to produce those energy resources. And the reality is the poorest among us are the ones that need it the most. I find it terribly cruel and inhumane when people start trying to limit affordable energy and affordable food. I think it's sick.
I was thinking about, there's people in Congress, and I think about this from the corporate world too. How many of these people in Congress are agreeing, oh, that's a great idea, we need to track it for disease purposes, and they've never once stepped on a farm? They have no idea what it's like to live in a farmer's shoes.
Can you see AOC on a farm? Can you see her visiting a Wyoming farm or a Missouri corn farm? Can you see that? I mean, that would be like she already has looks like a horse. But you know what I mean? But can you imagine that? I didn't mean it. Okay, go ahead. Sorry, I got off track. I forgot my Adderall before the show.
So there are some very, very good people in Congress. There are some good people in Congress.
Yep.
But the vast majority of them are not involved or related to or fully understand the very industries that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. So we have doctors, and that's fabulous because I'm not a medical guy, and I'm glad that we have the medical side of things. We have a lot of military, veterans, and I think that's fantastic with some of the issues that we deal with, and they're very good, and I have a great amount of respect for them. And there are some farmers and ranchers, and I think probably most of them agree with me. What it is it's just a bigger issue than just EID, and that is that we have allowed these administrative agencies to control our lives in ways that Congress never intended, that the law doesn't provide, but they're adopting rules. And what you find, so I was a trial attorney for 34 years before I went into Congress. Most of the work I did for the last 20 some years was against federal agencies. So I fought the EPA. I had a case in Wyoming where the EPA came in and claimed that an irrigation ditch was a navigable water of the United States, brought an enforcement action against my client because he cleaned out the ditch. And by the time we went to trial, he was facing penalties of $65 million for affecting 2.1 acres of land on his own property. We went to trial. It was a 2-week trial. We eventually won. Thank goodness he had the resources to do that. But that is what we have allowed these administrative agencies to do. They are pursuing political policy. They're making policy through persecuting people, through enforcement actions, through regulations, through demanding that we adopt things like EID mandates, or that we use BQA, beef quality assurance requirements. What they're doing is we are stockpiling more and more and more power in Washington, D.C. with, as you say, people who have no level of expertise of how we actually do things in the interior West or as farmers or ranchers. But also we're giving them more and more power. And the more power they take, the more power they want. The more power they want, the more power they take. Who gave the USDA the authority to adopt a regulation requiring a cattle rancher in Fort Laramie, Wyoming, to put an RFID ear tag on their cattle or their bison?
Right.
We didn't give them that authority, but they've taken it. And so what I really want to see is I want to see our legislators, our congressional representatives do much more in terms of pushing back. That's why probably my biggest agenda item is APA, Administrative Procedure Act reform. Not all that sexy, not all that interesting to a lot of people, but it is to me. And what I want to do, and I've been working on with Thomas Massey on the Administrative Law and Regulatory Reform Subcommittee with the Judiciary Committee, is we've been identifying ways in which we can rein in the power of these administrative agencies. I think we've made some huge progress. We've got some standalone bills as well as more of a comprehensive look at it. But I actually think that's the key to this, because we can't just go agency by agency by agency. We got to cut off the head of the snake, and the snake is the APA.
Wow. So before we cut you loose, there's one thing that was, when we were talking about the feedlots, I want your opinion. I work in insurance, and I do construction insurance. So I travel out to Kansas. I'm looking at them constructing a big grain leg on this feedlot. The wind was coming out of the east. I came in from the west. The ammonia smell was so bad on the lot, we had to actually back up and come in from the east because we couldn't breathe. Excuse me. And so my point is, those cattle were stomping around in mud, urine,
feces,
manure,
everything.
They're getting fed out of a trough. But how is that healthy?
I don't know, and I don't want to criticize our packers or our feeders because they're so critically important for our industry, for the cattle industry.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know what the circumstance was at that time. They moved those cattle through fairly quickly. They tried to. But the only reason that I'm saying that this isn't a real traceability rule is because it only applies to a certain percentage of the cattle. And they're not the ones that are typically going to have the kind of disease outbreaks that the USDA is concerned about. So again, I think that we just need to start using better common sense than what we have. Mm-hmm. And we've really got to start protecting our industries and recognizing that this ESG nonsense is to make us very, very poor. And I'm going to tell you one other story. We have done a terrible, terrible disservice to a lot of countries in Africa because we will not allow them, not we, but the UN and the WHO and all of these NGOs have for years prevented them from being able to build the infrastructure that they need to have reliable and affordable energy. And as a result, they're still using dung for their fires and they're still getting water. And then we send, all this money, and you have UNICEF and you have the Peace Corps and you have all these organizations going over there, and we're going to protect all of
Don't trust them at all.
But we won't give them affordable and reliable energy. We won't give them electricity. And it is one of the things where it's exactly what I'm talking about. Look at what we are doing in third world countries to prevent them from being able to access what we've had access to for the last 100 years. And it's very cruel. It's very inhumane, but it's what the globalists want. And I think it's wrong. I want them to have access to what we do. I want to help them to build the infrastructure that they need so that they can have reliable energy for their schools and their hospitals and their industries. And it's a bizarre time that we live in where the people who claim to be compassionate are some of the most inhumane people you'll ever meet in your life.
Some of it's fake. So
I told the ESG folks, I looked at them and I said, you people are evil.
People jump on that. My company jumps on that.
A lot of companies jump
on it. And then once I saw they started producing this ESG report, then I understood why they started pushing all the DEI training and all that stuff. Yep. ESG is not even a law or regulation. It's the globalists push something down on everybody.
It is. That's exactly what it is.
But look at John Deere's a good example. Look what they've kind of been dabbling in that ESG stuff. They just got their hand slapped on DEI, Tractor Supply. Look what they did. They got smacked down pretty quick after that. But you mentioned a while ago.
It's discriminatory. What I cannot
horrible.
figure out is why anybody who believes in human nature, why anybody who believes in the human condition, why anybody who believes that everybody is fully capable of thriving and succeeding, why they would even buy into this, but there's really big money in it. at our universities with the DEI, with the ESG, and these folks that we had in front of the Judiciary Committee a couple of weeks ago. These people make massive amounts of money on propaganda and the ESG and really lying to the American people and lying to the world. Look right now, Germany, one of the most industrialized nations in the world, and as a result being one of the most economically successful, is deindustrializing itself because of global warming. They are literally deindustrializing themselves before our very eyes and destroying their economy. Who would what political leader would do that? I just don't think that my job or my role is to make people's lives worse. I think that's the exact opposite of what my job is.
Well, you mentioned
I've always thought DEI stood for division, equally, and intentional.
Interesting.
But, I just saw yesterday, University of Alabama and University of Missouri both dropped their DEI things. And then I dig a little deeper. It's like, oh, but wait, we're dropping it, but we're just moving the staff to student affairs, to a couple offices down the hall. But we're going to keep them intact. We're going to keep them on the payroll, but we're not really going to call it DEI. So we're just going to kind of sort of do it under the rug. But you mentioned a while ago all these 3- and 4-letter agencies, Harriet. Years ago, 20, 30 years ago, there was an elderly gentleman who farmed next to us, bordered our farms. And he told my uncle one day, he's like, I forget, the conservation department or whatever, he's like, they're after me. He said, they're going to keep up. They're going to break me. And we're like, well, what happened? What'd you do? I needed to clear a half to an acre of trees on my farm so I could farm it so it would drain. And they had an absolute conniption fit because what it was going to do to the wildlife and the waterfowl. And I'm like, this is absolute lunacy.
Lunacy.
Beyond lunacy.
That's what a lot of this is about. And that's why you pull a thread, and then there's another thread, and then another thread, and another thread, and you start really searching through and tracing this stuff down and tracing it back, and you start realizing that a lot of this stuff is interconnected, and that there truly are evil people out there who believe in depopulation, who do believe that they should be in control, who have just been horrified for decades about the freedom and liberty that we have in the United States and want that changed. And, unfortunately, we've been electing a lot of those people over the last 30 years, and we've really got to start paying a lot more attention to what's going on, and people got to get a lot smarter.
All right. Well, I tell you what, it's been a pleasure having you on, but there is one thing I need to know is, where does this stand right now? You're going to try to block this at some point.
The EID regulation is set to go into effect this fall, but I have an amendment on the Department of Ag Appropriations bill to defund it. Here's the other thing: USDA's estimate is $26.1 million. As I said, that's for roughly 11%, 10 to 11% of all cattle and bison in the country. But in their own bill, or in their own regulation, they're only seeking $15 million to offset the costs. That $15 million will never go to a farmer or a rancher. It will only go to implement the program at the USDA. So they're seeking money to implement the program, but it's all going to be more bureaucracy. It's not actually going to our cattle and bison producers. So it's scheduled to go into effect. So I'm attempting to defund it so that they cannot implement it at all. And then we will be doing a standalone bill as well to prohibit USDA and APHIS from adopting an EID mandate.
Well, we've talked a lot on this show about cattle, but I want to talk about sheep real quick because I never knew up until COVID how sheepified the people are. And I saw what they did with the masks. I saw what they did with the vaccines. They just did it, didn't even ask a question. I remember I was at the barber shop one day, and the barber was cutting this old guy's hair, and he's like, the guy getting his haircut, he's like, well, by golly, Jim, if they want to keep their job, they better get that vaccine. I'm like, oh my gosh. But people lined up to do the masks. They lined up to do the vaccines. They just did whatever they were told to do, and no questions asked. My question, Harriet, is with a lot of these 2, 3, 4-letter agencies, no matter what industry you're in, let's say it's farming, because that's what our topic of today's discussion is. At what point do farmers and or ranchers just say, no, we've had enough of the nonsense. We're done. We're not going to pay attention to all your craziness, all your NGO implied, ESG and some more 3-letter acronyms. At what point do they just push back and say, no, we're not going to comply anymore. Do what you have to do, but you're not going to get my compliance?
So the problem with this is that for a state like Wyoming, you're not going to be allowed to transfer your cattle across state lines for either putting into a feedlot or for sale. And the reason they want the EID, they want the ear tags, is because if you try to run your cattle through a sale barn, they will prohibit them from being able to go through go into commerce.
Wow.
So that's what they've done, is they're creating a roadblock. They're building a wall that makes it almost impossible to ignore. That's why people like me need to start doing a lot better job of pushing back and stopping this stuff from happening. But, we've been conditioned for a long, long time. And I filed the very first lawsuit against vaccine mandates in the United States. With the law firm that I was with at the time, we sued Michigan State University because they refused to recognize natural immunity. We filed the very first lawsuit against the CDC for their eviction moratorium. We filed the lawsuits against the federal government for the employees and the contractors, and we won those in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. So I was very much at the forefront because I'm like you. I said the Constitution doesn't take a vacation just because you're a little worried or somebody got sick. And everything that they did about that was a matter of conditioning people. And I had the same reaction you did. I remember the first time I went back to DC after they started allowing travel again, and I was walking around outside not wearing a mask. And I was there for like 4 days. I never saw one other person that was not wearing a mask outside or inside. And they would stare at me and they would walk across the street to get away from me. And I thought, you can't be that dumb. You just can't be that dumb. You just cannot believe I saw people going by on bicycles just sweating buckets because they couldn't breathe, wearing masks as they were exercising. And I thought, I cannot believe that people were willing to allow their government to do this to them.
And we still see today. I saw a person last week wearing a mask in their car, literally wearing a mask in their car driving. And this is Kansas City.
It's bizarre. It's bizarre. It is. It is.
Harriet, give us one piece of parting actionable advice for us and for our viewers and our audience.
Contact your legislators at the state and federal level and say, these are some of the things that we heard Harriet Hageman from Wyoming talking about the other day. What are you doing to make sure that these agencies are staying within their confines, that they're being bookended, and that they're not doing things that they shouldn't be doing? And how do we make sure that our legislative branch actually takes back the power? Because it's not just at the federal level, but it's the state level too. Here's the thing. We work for you guys. You don't work for us. We work for you. And our job is to protect you from the executive branch at this point. I don't know that people really think of it that way, but these agencies are out of control. And you need to be talking to your legislators and your representatives in Congress as to what they're doing to make sure that they are not taking away our civil rights, our property rights, and our ability to make decisions for ourselves.
Well, I am so glad you were on here today. I did not know that you were a trial attorney, and I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when you were suing those three-letter agencies during COVID. I applaud anybody that pushed back against anybody on mandates and all the craziness that we've all gone through in the last 4.5 years. But thanks for doing your work today on everything in the agriculture industry. I think we need to have a lot more people like you in government who grew up in a rural area and has common sense.
Thank you.
We appreciate everything you're doing. Hope to have you back on in the future for an update and just to see what else is going on out there.
All right. Thank you.
All right, Harriet. Thanks so much. Take care.
See you.